Hi everyone, it's Wayne from ISG once again, back with PV Kannan from 247.ai. Again, real pleasure to have PV join us this week. Thinking about what we discussed kind of last week, we spoke about COVID, the impacts, the challenges, the solutions. There are some real great insights on how both organizations and agents of having to deal with the significant changes that they've had to undertake with home working, and interestingly, significant shifts even in the channels that they're having to work in. And I guess one of the key points that we ended on last week was around the pandemic really being a kickstarter for a lot of digital initiatives in the contact center. And despite the fact that PV and I had spent years talking about channel shift, enabling channel shift across the organizations that we've been working with, we still have failed in comparison to COVID in regards to seeing some significant channel shift. And I think PV spoke about organizations that for years had been at 10 to 15% of their contacts within digital, suddenly now seeing 70% of their inbound contacts now moving into those digital channels. Today, we're going to talk a little bit more about what that enables, and I guess what that enables is automation. And as we start to see the shift from voice to digital, the power and the usage of conversational AI, and how human in the loop, chatbots, voice bots, etc., how they really start to be channels that organizations can really start to take advantage of. So PV, welcome. Thank you for your time again. I know you're an extremely busy man, but it's always fantastic to gauge your insights. And for anyone who didn't watch last week's session, please do revisit it, because there's some absolute gold dust in there from PV. This week, let's start with messaging. Now, PV, you've been around messaging for as long as I have, and even beyond. So, you've seen this as a channel evolve. Where do you think it's going over the next few years?
Yep. So, you talked about digital, enabling automation at higher levels than voice. Let's actually double click on that for a second, because I think it's a very important distinction. And there is a way to, make voice as effective as digital in automation, but most people it's a non-traditional way of thinking, right? The big reason digital does a better job at, self-service, and actually, the engagement level with customers and consumers are very high, is because it's visual. It's a visual medium. So as long as the content is not just words, and you're leveraging, pictures and comparisons, and it allows the human brain to process that information in a more effective way, right? And in the traditional voice channel, the way the IVRs are designed, they are long, monotonous, set of choices that you have to make, right? Press one for this, and so you get naturally bored. And the other thing is, we don't remember it, right? When you come to the option number 6, you're like, what was option number 1, right? And so there is this it's against human nature the way it is designed, right? Whereas in even in a self-service experience, I think Apple does many things really well. But if you go to their website and start the self-service experience, even though I've logged in with my Apple ID, it will still ask me, is this about your iPad or Mac or whatever, when I have only one product from you, which is iPad, right? So even there, the experience is not good, but it's still much faster for me to go click, 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 put in the details and get going. And so I think the medium is, a big difference. And now, there is visual IVRs and other things which can, do the same thing in the medium, but I don't think companies have invested enough in that, right? And more importantly, consumers have voted, strongly in favor of digital, right? So why even bother building those capabilities if you can do it in the medium, right? You talked about the human and the automation and how they come together. For me, the biggest insight, and why I started 24/7, is in the past, self-service companies used to be in their own category. And then there were assisted service companies, whether it's Cisco or chat companies, they would be in one bucket. And what I've found puzzling was you don't know why self-service would fail unless you look at the conversation, right? And so for me, it was always that these need to come together, number one. But more importantly, an agent can actually course correct what the bot got wrong, and then the learning loop becomes much faster. So for us at 24/7, that it seems almost natural that you think about it this way, because every time an agent sees a bot got an intent wrong, they can actually correct it before they resume the conversation with the customer, and that has definitely improved the automation rates, right? The other opportunity with digital is you don't have to think of a conversation in a linear fashion, right? Because it comes back from the roots of the call center, where you were on the phone, you had no idea what the customer was doing, so you had to always open with, how can I help you? Get all the information from the customer and then go solve the problem, right? In digital, you have to think the opposite. You already know what the customer is doing. They're trying to transfer monies to some relative abroad, or they're trying to decide between two phone models. So if the intent is automatically captured, then the conversation starts at that point, not like, who are you, how can I help you? It's like, I already know you're trying to compare between two models and need some help there, right? So those kind of things make the whole experience more natural than the stop-start paradigm. I'm doing something, I have to stop it, pick up the phone, call, and get that thing done. Here, it's just a natural flow into it. So even in digital conversations, if it is not well designed, you don't get great outcomes, right? So if you still have the old, how can I help you? And I have to input all the information. In a hotel example, if I have to tell you I'm traveling to London and the dates are this, you just made my, put more effort into getting help, right? So there's a whole aspect of design that goes into it, into how do you make it naturally flow into what the consumer was doing so that they get their outcome faster, right? And talking about the traditional linear model, you could break into chunks, and if messaging is asynchronous, you could allow the bot to help agents put stuff together, right? So so the whole paradigm of this conversation where we both took turns and both sides were a human is kind of a old model. Now you have to think about bot in the middle. Even if a human agent is involved or not involved, what are all the permutation combination which you can execute work, and where can I delegate tasks to a bot that can take care of the customer and I don't have to be there, right? So that's kind of how we look at it, and we have composed a solution so that you can break a conversation, and over a period of time, with the agent's help, you're going to automate more and more of this.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting model. And I think even those that have been early adopters, I think there's still so much more that we can do. I guess what we mean by digital, for those that are wondering, is it's digital channels, it's social, it's messaging. So if you think about Twitter to a degree, Facebook to a degree, the ones that are really growing, Apple Business Chat, Google Messaging, WhatsApp, Facebook Messenger. So when we talk about digital channels, these are the types of channels that we're talking about. And I guess even for those that have adopted digital early, one of the things I still don't believe is that we've truly realized the true benefit of moving from a conversation like this to a conversation like this. We really need to start thinking about the role that our eyes can play, not just our mouth and our ears. And I think that is a mindset shift that we really need to start thinking about more frequently. So I guess I'm also loving here the context of the bot in the middle, and thinking about the cost efficiencies, the time efficiency, both for the agent and obviously for the customer, the improved experience, and all of this being kind of put in this mixing pot. And it's always, as I say, really excited me about this ability to digitize a conversation, and it's so much more than just the language being used. Still feels like there's still not enough organizations to change the mindset, from phone to digital. You were a visionary. You saw this earlier on. Why do you still feel like it's untapped?
Yeah, you're right. And oftentimes it's never a priority to think through these things, right? And so for a variety of reasons, it has never caught on traditionally. Like we talked in our previous conversation, the pandemic gave digital a chance to shine, and it has really shown what it can do. So I would say people who went and took a chance on messaging came out of it with a stronger conviction that their consumers really want to engage with them digitally, and that it's actually a better channel to take care of customers. Due to the factors I mentioned, that it's visual, you can put more visual content in front of them. The conversation is actually faster, right? So, and it allows the consumer to move away from the conversation if they want to do it in async, right? And the bot can do the job of collecting all the information. The traditional async, to a large extent, was email, and it failed because you'd email something, there was no structure to it, and then the agent will say, well, you didn't give me this, this, and this, and then the customer will go back and give A, B, and C, and they'll say, no, but C is not right, it's not validated, your account number is wrong, or whatever it is, because you missed a single digit, right? So that whole experience just imploded, and email didn't become a favored channel. But here with digital and with the bot in the middle, you can validate all of that, make sure you've got what you need. More importantly, don't even ask the customer, right? You go figure out. And with technologies like Facebook Messenger, Apple Business Chat, Google Messaging, the other thing is the customer is already authenticated, right? So you don't have to do authentication 10 times, right? You could leverage the Face ID and other technologies built into the phone and pair it with your internal identification, and that's a very powerful mechanism that's now available. The other part, which is the most interesting for both the customer and the brand, is there's a history of the conversation, right? In async, just like with our friends and family, when you chat, you can always go back and go, hey, what picture did that person send 2 weeks back, and you can get to it. Here, the commitments made by the customer or the commitments made by the consumer, they're all embedded in the conversation, right? If the customer says, hey, you promised me 3 months of free HBO with this package, you can go back and say, look, it was on this day, and and the agent can see it as well. So it takes away a lot of the noise factor that happens where you kind of feel like there is an impersonal connection with the brand. It's never personal. And I think messaging, if done well and executed well, gives a lasting personal connection to brands.
Great insight as always, PV. And I guess a couple of things you touched upon. I love the idea of email failing. If you think about why, it's not necessarily the fact that it is a written communication channel, because we've seen when it's managed in different ways that actually asynchronous type messaging channels are probably the ones with the highest satisfaction at the moment. However, we're not responding to a WhatsApp message in 48 hours, 72 hours, or a week's SLA. We're responding to it in a timely manner. And I guess that's one of the key reasons why email probably failed. If you're having a conversation with a friend on Facebook Messenger and you're only responding once every week, guess what? You're not going to get very far very quickly. And I guess that's one of the key reasons potentially why email, as a channel, was seen as absolutely one of the lowest scoring from a customer satisfaction perspective. Not because you can't resolve queries through email, but the elongated nature of getting a resolution was clearly not one that was floating the boat of many consumers. I guess one of the key differences around asynchronous channels is planning. And one of the challenges with either voice or online chat is you generally have customers queuing. They're expecting a response and they're staring at their screen or they're waiting on hold. There is no downtime. It's a constant conversation, whether you're waiting on hold, whether you're waiting for a response. It's an in the moment channel. Obviously, asynchronous, less like that. It's kind of deal with it, put it down, pick it up as and when you are ready. Now, there's always a risk associated with that, I guess, from a brand perspective. One of them being that because a customer could in theory take as long as they wanted to respond, the brand could take it that that's also okay for them. And I guess that's one of the key risks around experience. And maybe that's one of the reasons why, again, going back to the email example, there were some significant challenges around that. Obviously, having a bot in the middle is and being in the mix is obviously one of the things that can really ensure that there's always someone or something there, regardless of time of day, etc. And I guess that can really help. So, loads of great insight there. Once again, conscious again of time, but as always, absolutely amazing to catch up, PV, to talk about the industry and the future. And I can't wait to next week's show when we really start to dive into automation. So yeah, look forward to that, guys, and I'll speak to you then. Cheers. Bye.
Thanks, Wayne. Thanks for having me.